The sky above the gallows was the color of bruised iron. A bitter wind whipped dry snow across the wooden platform, making the heavy timber groan under the weight of the gathered crowd. Ada stood on the trapdoor, her wrists bleeding into the cold iron shackles. She did not tremble when the executioner stepped forward, nor when the Duke, his eyes cold and exhausted, gave the final order. "Strip her coat," he commanded. "Let the rope bite flesh." The executioner tore the ruined wool from her shoulders. The crowd murmured, but the trapdoor never opened. The Duke's breath hitched. Branded across her pale, emaciated back was a horrific map of layered burn scars. Dead center between her shoulder blades rested the precise, unmistakable stamp of the illegal blasting powder that had killed his son years ago. The husband she was condemned for murdering wasn't dead at all. He was the exact monster the Duke had been hunting. The ending to this twisted game of survival will leave you completely breathless. Before we dive into the dark depths of the mine, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. The courtroom in Blackwood Creek smelled of damp wool, stale tobacco, and the copper tang of fear. Ada sat on a splintered wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were white, the skin stretched thin over bone. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of 100 hateful eyes pressing against her. In the front row, her Aunt Martha, the only blood relative she had left, was crying. But they weren't tears of grief. They were the performative sobs of a woman who had already sold Ada's few belongings before the trial even began. Martha leaned over to the woman next to her, whispering loud enough for the whole room to hear. She was always a strange one. Quiet, cold. "I told Silas not to marry her. I told him that girl had the devil's silence in her. And look what she did. Push that poor, hard-working man right into the dark." Ada's throat tightened. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them about the hard-working man who had pinned her against the furnace door just 2 nights prior. She wanted to show them the fresh, weeping burns he had given her because she hadn't scrubbed the coal dust from his boots fast enough. But the words were trapped. They had been trapped since the fever took her voice as a child. Her silence wasn't a choice. It was a cage. The judge, a man named Henderson with skin like yellow parchment, hammered his gavel. The sound cracked through the room like a bone breaking. "The court has heard the testimony," Henderson barked. "The foreman saw you at the lip of the shaft. He saw your hands out. He saw Silas fall. In this territory, the law is simple. Life for a life." The foreman, a man named Miller with teeth stained yellow by juice, gave a slow, predatory nod from the witness stand. He was Silas's best friend. He was also the man who helped Silas move the stolen silver in the dead of night. He knew Ada had seen them. He knew she was a witness who couldn't testify. "Hang her high," a voice shouted from the back. It was the sheriff, leaning against the doorframe, picking his teeth with a splinter. He was the man of morality, the keeper of peace, and he had spent the last year taking bribes from Silas to look the other way when the mine safety inspections failed. The verdict was a formality. The exile had already begun. They dragged her out of the courtroom and into the town square. The sun was a pale, sickly disk behind the clouds. People she had known her whole life, the grocer who sold her flour, the midwife who had patched her wounds, spat at her feet. Ada didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the horizon. Crying didn't warm a room. Crying didn't stop a beating. She simply endured. The transition from the gallows, the moment the Duke stopped the execution, was a blur of steel and cold wind. The warrant was stayed, but she was not free. "She is coming with me," the Duke had said, his voice like grinding stones. The guards didn't help her into the transport wagon. They threw her. Her shoulder hit the floorboards and a sharp pain flared through her bruised back. She didn't make a sound. She crawled into the corner, pulling her knees to her chest. The wagon rattled. Unforgiving iron wheels slammed into frozen ruts. Every violent jolt sent a spike of white-hot pain through Ada's branded back. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. The two guards sat opposite her on the wooden bench, their breath pluming in the freezing air. They drank cheap, harsh whiskey from a tin flask and ignored her. She was no longer a person. She was cargo. Less than cargo. She was evidence. The cold seeped up through the rotting floorboards. It bit into her thin, bare ankles and turned her toes numb. She rubbed her palms together, feeling the thick, rough calluses scrape against each other. The friction was a grounding force. It reminded her she was alive. Silas had tried to break her spirit by breaking her body. He had failed. She had survived the searing heat of his branding irons. She would survive the frost. One of the guards, a heavy-set man with a pock-scarred face, reached into a burlap sack. He tossed a half-frozen heel of black bread at her. It hit her knee and clattered onto the dirty wood. Ada stared at it. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out with her shackled hands, brushed off the grit, and took a bite. It tasted like ash and stale yeast. She chewed the hard crust methodically. Pride did not fill an empty belly. Survival required swallowing everything else. Outside, the rhythmic, heavy thud of hooves marked the Duke's relentless pace. Lord Vance rode at the head of the small convoy. He didn't look back, not once. Through the gaps in the wagon's canvas cover, Ada watched his silhouette, a broad back, a stiff, unyielding spine. His heavy wool greatcoat absorbed the falling snow. He was a man completely hollowed out by grief, driving himself forward on nothing but the fumes of vengeance. Ada recognized the posture. It was the exact same way she stood at the washboard after a brutal beating. Rigid. Focused only on the immediate task. He had seen the explosive brand on her skin. He knew she held the key to the mine explosion that had buried his son, but to him she was merely a tool to pry the truth from the dirt. He didn't care about the woman beneath the scars. Ada understood this perfectly. Pity was a luxury for the rich. Utility was the only currency of the poor. The mining town of Blackwood Creek faded into a gray, insignificant smudge behind them. The terrain grew instantly harsher. The jagged teeth of the ironwood ridge rose against the horizon, cutting into the low-hanging clouds. Pine trees, stripped bare by the relentless mountain wind, looked like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The road narrowed into a treacherous mountain pass. The wagon tilted precariously, its wheels crushing brittle ice. Night fell like a heavy stone. The temperature plummeted further. Ada curled tighter into herself. She focused her mind entirely on her breathing. In, out. Count the jolts of the axle. 100, 200. Hunger clawed at her stomach again, hollow and sharp. She closed her eyes and imagined the repetitive, heavy motion of kneading dough. Push down, fold over, turn, push, fold, turn. The phantom physical labor kept her mind from fracturing. It kept the terrifying memories of Silas's heavy footsteps echoing in the dark shaft at bay. The journey lasted 2 agonizing days. 2 days of absolute silence, 2 days of freezing wind and icy stares. When the wagon finally slowed to a halt, the air had grown dangerously thin and sharp. The horses panted heavily, their coats slick with freezing sweat. They had reached the high country. The heavy iron latch of the wagon groaned as a guard yanked the doors open. Brutal, glaring white light flooded the cramped space. Ada squeezed her eyes shut. The sudden blast of alpine air felt like a physical blow to her chest. "Get out," the guard grunted. Ada moved. Her joints were locked from the freezing cold. Pain radiated from her branded shoulders down to her frozen toes. She didn't stumble. She forced her stiff muscles to obey, lowering herself from the wagon bed. Her bare, blistered feet hit the frost-hardened earth. She looked up. Blackwood Manor did not welcome guests. It was a fortress built against the mountain, carved from the very gray stone that surrounded it. There were no manicured lawns, no flower beds hidden beneath the snow, no lace curtains softening the harsh angles of the windows. It was a structure built for endurance, not comfort. It looked exactly like the man who owned it, massive, cold, and entirely devoid of life. Lord Vance stood at the top of the sweeping stone stairs. He had already dismounted. He didn't wait for her. He simply turned and strode through the massive oak double doors, his heavy boots echoing like gunfire against the stone. A woman emerged from the shadows of the doorway, Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper. She wore a severe black dress, her gray hair pulled so tightly into a bun it seemed to stretch the skin of her face taut. Her eyes swept over Ada. She saw the shackles. She saw the filth. She saw the ruined clothes and the blood seeping through the hasty bandages over her shoulders. Mrs. Higgins's expression did not change. There was no pity in this house. Pity was a weakness. "Bring her to the scullery," Mrs. Higgins instructed the guards. Her voice was flat, devoid of inflection. "Remove the irons. She can't scrub floors with her hands bound." They marched Ada inside. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off the howl of the wind. The silence that replaced it was heavy, suffocating. The interior of the manor was a cavern. The vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadows. The stone walls were bare. No portraits, no tapestries to hold the heat. The hearths they passed were dark, swept completely clean of ashes. It was a house that had stopped breathing. It was a tomb for a man who was still walking. They led her down a narrow, unlit servants' corridor. The air grew damper, smelling of harsh lye soap and root vegetables. The guards shoved her into a sparse, freezing room, a stone sink, a wooden bucket, a pile of rough, undyed wool in the corner that was supposed to be a bed. The guards unlocked her shackles. The iron fell to the stone floor with a loud clang. They left without a word, locking the thick wooden door behind them. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the small space. Ada stood alone in the center of the room. She rubbed her raw wrists. Her skin was chafed and bleeding. She looked at the stone sink. She looked at the heavy scrub brush resting on its edge. Slowly, she walked over, picked up the brush, and ran her thumb over the stiff, unyielding bristles. The work would begin. The work would keep her sane. She was in the void, and in the void, she would survive. The stone floor was a block of ice. Ada woke before dawn. Her breath plumed in the darkness of the scullery. Her muscles screamed in protest as she sat up. The coarse wool blanket had offered no warmth. She ignored the pain radiating from her branded back. Pain was familiar. Pain meant she was awake. Pain meant she was alive. She didn't wait for Mrs. Higgins. Ada went to the stone sink, cracked the thin layer of ice over the water bucket with her knuckles, and plunged her hands into the freezing depths. She grabbed the heavy scrub brush. She found a block of harsh, unperfumed lye soap. She dropped to her knees. She began to scrub the flagstones. The repetitive, violent friction burned her shoulders, pulling at her half-healed skin, but it silenced the memories of the gallows. Scrub, rinse, wring, repeat. Push the weight down. Let the physical labor anchor the mind. By the time Mrs. Higgins unlocked the heavy wooden door, a third of the kitchen floor was raw, wet, and perfectly clean. The housekeeper's sharp eyes registered the manual labor, but her face remained impassive. "Up!" Mrs. Higgins commanded. "His Grace wants you in the main hall. Now." Ada dried her raw, cracked hands on her tattered skirt. She followed the housekeeper through the dark labyrinth of the manor. The house was awake, but it wasn't alive. It felt like walking through the belly of a dead beast. Dust motes danced in the pale morning light that struggled to penetrate the narrow, high windows. Lord Vance stood by the unlit hearth in the great hall. He wore a crisp white shirt, but it hung loosely on his broad frame. He looked like a man who had forgotten to eat for a decade. He stared at a jagged piece of black coal in his hand, his thumb rubbing relentlessly over its sharp edge. When he looked up, Ada saw his eyes clearly for the first time. They were ruins, empty, worn down, and gray. The sharp, vengeful fire that had burned in them at the execution was gone, replaced by a suffocating, heavy exhaustion. He was a man slowly drowning under the weight of his own survival. "You are alive because you are useful," Vance said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of malice, devoid of warmth. It was just a fact. "Your scars prove you survived Silas Thorne's inner circle. That means you know the deep tunnels, the off-book drafts." Ada didn't nod. She just stared at the tips of his dusty riding boots. "The magistrate in Blackwood thinks you are a murderer," Vance continued, dropping the coal into the dead hearth. The clatter echoed loudly in the empty room. "I think you are a victim who got lucky. But I don't care about your innocence. I care about the powder stamp burned into your flesh." He stepped closer. He smelled of bitter black coffee and old, damp paper. "Here are the terms of your existence in this house," Vance stated, his tone flat and unyielding. "You will earn your keep. You will do the work Mrs. Higgins assigns. You will scrub. You will haul wood. You will bake. You will keep your head down." Ada finally lifted her chin and met his gaze. Her face was a mask of stone. She did not flinch. "You are mute." "Good," he said, turning his back to her. "Keep it that way. I require absolute quiet. I do not want to hear you. I barely want to see you, and there is one final rule." He stopped at the edge of the hall, raising a hand to point toward a heavy, iron-studded door at the end of the adjacent corridor. The shadows seemed to pool thicker around that specific archway. "The East Wing. The map room," Vance said, his voice dropping an octave, a dangerous, brittle edge creeping into the syllables. "You do not look at that door. You do not clean that corridor. You stay completely away from the East Wing. If I catch you near it, I will personally drag you back to the magistrate. Do we understand each other?" Ada gave a single, slow nod. She understood perfectly. Men with locked doors always had ghosts trapped behind them. Silas had a locked cellar where he kept his stolen silver and his heavy leather belts. Lord Vance had the East Wing. "Mrs. Higgins," Vance called out without looking back, walking toward his private study. "Put her to work. Break her back if you have to. Just keep her out of my way until I need her." The heavy door of his study clicked shut. Ada stood in the center of the massive freezing hall. The terms were set. The arrangement was forced. It was cruel, and it was cold, but it was a far cry from a rope around her neck. The days bled into a rhythm of brutal, unforgiving labor. Ada preferred it that way. Idleness was the enemy. Idleness allowed the memories to creep in. The suffocating smell of sulfur, the heavy, deliberate thud of Silas's boots on the wooden stairs, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. Labor pushed it all down. She started every morning at the woodpile. The axe was heavy, its ash handle smooth from decades of use, but the iron head was dull. She didn't ask for a whetstone. She hauled the massive frozen pine logs to the chopping block behind the kitchens. The wind howled off the ironwood ridge, biting through her thin, coarse dress, but sweat soon slicked her brow. She raised the axe. She brought it down. Crack! The wood split. She raised it again. Crack! Every swing was a physical release. Every swing was a brick added to the wall she was building between herself and the past. Her shoulders screamed in protest. The freshly healed burns across her back stretched and pulled agonizingly with every downward strike. She welcomed the sharp, biting sting. It was honest pain. It was a pain she controlled. Inside, the sanctuary of chores continued. She plunged her raw, cracked hands into boiling cauldrons of water to scrub the estate's heavy linens. The lye bit into her open blisters. She kneaded thick, stubborn bread dough on the floured wooden table. Push down, fold over, turn. Her knuckles bled into the white flour occasionally. She simply wiped them on her apron and kept kneading. Mrs. Higgins watched her like a hawk, waiting for the frail-looking, mute woman to collapse under the sheer volume of work. Ada never did. She moved like a machine built of bone, scars, and absolute silence. The physical exhaustion was a thick, heavy blanket that smothered her panic. The manor itself was a tomb. It swallowed sound, but as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks and the freezing night settled over Blackwood, the silence shifted. It lost its emptiness and became heavy, expectant. Ada lay on her pile of rough wool in the scullery, staring at the frost creeping across the high stone window. This was when the true resident of the house revealed himself. Lord Vance did not sleep. Through the thick stone walls, Ada could hear the manifestation of his trauma. It usually started near midnight, the slow, rhythmic, heavy thud of his boots pacing the floorboards above, back and forth, like a caged wolf slowly going mad. He was pacing the length of the forbidden east wing, the map room. Sometimes the pacing stopped abruptly. A heavy thud would follow, a fist slamming against a solid oak table. Then came the faint, muffled sound of glass shattering against a stone hearth. Shortly after, a distinct smell would drift down through the iron ventilation grates into Ada's freezing room. Burning paper, bitter pipe tobacco. The acrid scent of a man destroying his own life's work out of sheer, unadulterated frustration. He was a man trying to solve a puzzle with poisoned pieces. His son had died in an explosion that the Blackwood Mining Company officially ruled a tragic, unavoidable accident. A sudden pocket of natural gas, the inquest had claimed, but the Duke knew better, and Ada knew better. Silas had orchestrated it. He had planted the illegal blasting powder to collapse a shaft, desperately trying to seal off a network of illegal tunnels where he had been skimming silver veins off the official company ledgers. The explosion was only supposed to drop the ceiling. Instead, it triggered a chain reaction that took down the entire eastern corridor of the mine, taking the Duke's son and 20 other miners with it. Lord Vance was desperately looking for the structural flaw, the proof of foul play. He was poring over company maps night after night, completely blind to the lie because he didn't know the dirt. He didn't know the hidden air currents. He only knew ink and paper. Ada listened to the pacing above her. She recognized the rhythm. It was the rhythm of a person trapped under rubble, tapping frantically against a rock in the pitch black, hoping someone somewhere would hear them before the air ran out. They were two ghosts inhabiting the same graveyard. She was trapped by silence. He was trapped by grief. She rolled over, pulling the thin blanket tighter against her chin. The cold stone floor sapped the heat from her bones. Above her, the Duke continued his relentless march into the dark. Ada closed her eyes. Tomorrow there would be more wood to chop, more floors to scrub. She would survive the night. She always did. Winter tightened its grip on Blackwood Manor like an iron vise, the towering windows frosted over with thick, opaque ice, sealing them inside the stone tomb. The wind off the ironwood ridge shrieked relentlessly, rattling the heavy timber beams and stealing whatever meager warmth the hearths produced. Ada's routine remained unbroken. Chop wood, haul water, scrub stone, bake bread. But as the brutal weeks dragged, she began to notice the subtle physical deterioration of the man who held her leash. Lord Vance was a large man, built for command, but the flesh was rapidly melting off his bones. Mrs. Higgins prepared the Duke's meals: thick stews, roasted mutton, dark bread. Ada was tasked with carrying the heavy iron trays up the winding, drafty stairs to the threshold of his study. She was never to enter. She would place the tray on a small wooden table outside the door, knock once, and retreat into the shadows. Hours later, she would return to collect it. More often than not, the food was untouched. A thin, pale film of grease would have congealed over the cold stew. The heavy bread remained whole. Ada understood starvation intimately. Silas used hunger as a weapon. He would lock her in the damp root cellar for days, letting the hollow ache in her stomach twist into sharp, stabbing agony until she begged silently for scraps. But Vance was starving himself. He was using hunger to punish his own flesh. It was a physical penance for failing to save his blood. She observed other things too. When she cleaned the massive stone grates in the great hall, she noticed the ash patterns. He was burning the fires too hot, too fast. He threw massive pine logs on the flames in erratic bursts of midnight energy, letting the fire roar uncontrollably, only to let the embers die completely an hour later. He didn't know how to sustain warmth. He only knew how to make it explode and watch it turn to gray dust. One evening, while carrying a punishing load of firewood down the main corridor, she saw him. He was standing by the large arched window at the end of the hall, staring out into the blinding white blizzard. He wore no coat. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. The freezing draft leaking through the window frames was enough to numb a man's face, but he didn't seem to feel the cold. His massive hands gripped the stone windowsill. His knuckles were bone white, trembling violently under the strain. He was breathing in shallow, jagged gasps, his chest heaving irregularly, his eyes wide and fixed on the jagged peaks of the distant mining ridge. It wasn't madness, it was panic. Ada knew the physical mechanics of terror. The sudden, terrifying inability to pull air into the lungs, the sensation of the ceiling crashing down, the crushing, suffocating weight on the chest. She used to press herself flat against the cold earth of the mine floor when the panic took her, letting the solid, immovable ground anchor her racing heart. Vance had no anchor. He was free-falling in a void of guilt. Ada stopped in the deep shadows. The rough bark of the pine logs dug fiercely into her scarred shoulder. She did not approach him. She did not make a sound. The rules were absolute. Keep quiet, stay out of sight, do the work. But she watched. She watched a powerful duke, a man who could end her existence with a single signed paper, break down in absolute silent agony. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his forehead against the freezing, frost-covered glass. A single ragged breath ripped through his throat, a sound so broken, so utterly defeated, it made Ada's own branded chest tighten. He was just as trapped as she was. The only difference was the size of the cage. Ada slowly backed away into the servants' corridor. She carried the heavy wood to the kitchen hearth. She didn't chop it recklessly. She arranged the logs with meticulous, silent care. The thickest, densest oak at the back to hold the heat. The fast-burning pine in the front to catch the spark. A slow, steady, enduring burn that would last until morning. The next dawn, when she brought his iron tray of oats and bitter black coffee to the study door, she didn't just leave it. She rearranged the items. She moved the steaming hot coffee cup directly against the ceramic bowl of oats to keep the food warm a fraction longer in the freezing draft. She placed the silver spoon precisely over the rim, forcing him to physically acknowledge the effort before he could push it away. Small, silent shifts, a language of utility. She wasn't saving him. She was simply maintaining the machinery of a broken house, but the invisible, rigid line between master and prisoner was beginning to crack. The freezing weeks turned into a brutal, unrelenting month. The silence in Blackwood Manor was no longer just an absence of sound. It had become a physical entity, a third resident breathing the icy air alongside them. The pacing of the story slowed to the agonizing rhythmic drip of melting icicles from the stone eaves. Ada's hands grew rougher, the skin splitting and bleeding from the harsh lie and the constant bitter cold, but she never stopped moving. Movement was her shield. Movement was survival. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to extend her sanctuary of chores beyond the kitchen and the scullery. It was not out of kindness, nor out of a desire to please. It was out of a desperate, ingrained need for order in a house consumed by internal chaos. One afternoon, while scrubbing the baseboards in the long main hall, she noticed a severe draft whistling under the heavy oak doors of the library. The draft was carrying fine, powdery snowmelt, rotting the expensive wood, and freezing the stone floor into a dangerous slick of ice. Ada didn't ask for permission. She went to the freezing stables, found discarded coarse burlap feed sacks, and spent 3 hours under the dim, flickering light of the scullery lamp braiding the rough twine into a thick, dense draft excluder. The coarse fibers tore at her healing blisters, her fingers cramped violently in the cold, but the repetitive, intricate motion anchored her mind. Push, weave, pull tight. She carried the heavy, ugly braid to the hall and pushed it firmly against the base of the library door. The whistling stopped immediately. The temperature in the hall stabilized. The next morning, while carrying firewood, she saw Lord Vance standing by the door, staring down at the braided burlap. He nudged it slightly with the toe of his heavy leather boot. He didn't look around for her, he didn't say a word of gratitude, he simply turned and walked into his study, but the draft excluder remained exactly where she had placed it. It became a silent, utilitarian negotiation of survival. When she noticed the hinges on the heavy iron gate outside his study screaming every time he paced past them, a sound that triggered a cold sweat on the back of her neck because it sounded like rusty mine carts, she used leftover bacon grease from the kitchen to silently lubricate the iron joints. The screeching stopped. The pacing continued, but the agonizing metallic shriek no longer pierced the dead of night. When she realized he was discarding the heavy, fat-laden stews Mrs. Higgins prepared, Ada quietly took over the evening meal preparations. She knew trauma stomach. She knew the physical nausea that accompanied sheer panic. She didn't make rich, heavy food that required a settled mind to digest. She baked hard, dense, salt-cured flatbreads and boiled clear, intensely nutrient-rich bone broths, food for a starving, cornered animal. Food that could be consumed mindlessly while staring blindly at maps. She left the iron tray by his door. When she returned hours later, the bowl was completely empty. They did not speak. They did not cross the invisible boundaries he had set on her first day. He was the warden of a freezing tomb, and she was the silent ghost haunting its halls. The rules of their cohabitation were strict, cold, and absolute. But the terrifying isolation of the manor began to shift. It was no longer a void. It was a shared purgatory. Ada would sit on her thin pallet in the dark, listening to the muffled, rhythmic thud of his boots above her. She no longer heard the footsteps of an executioner waiting to drop the trapdoor. She heard the footsteps of a man walking the exact same endless, suffocating, dark tunnels she was trapped in. He was looking for the truth in the ink. She already carried the truth in her scars. The maps locked in the east wing held the key to his torment, and they both knew she was the only living soul who had survived the dirt those maps represented. The tension in the house was pulling taut like a heavy iron chain on a mining winch. The forced arrangement was holding them together, but the silence was beginning to fracture under the crushing weight of the unspoken truth. The void was fully established. The foundation of their forced existence was laid in stone, frost, and blood. Now it only needed a single spark in the dark to blow it all wide open. The blizzard howled against the stone walls of Blackwood Manor for 3 unyielding days. The sky was a bruised, permanent gray. Inside the house, the temperature dropped so drastically that the water in Ada's wash basins froze solid within an hour. She was on her hands and knees in the upper gallery, a heavy block of pumice stone in her raw, bleeding hands. She was grinding the soot out of the flagstones. Grind, wipe, breathe! Her knuckles were cracked deep, the fissures packed with black dust. The physical agony in her joints was sharp, a grounding wire keeping her anchored to the floor. 20 paces down the gallery was the heavy oak door of the east wing, the forbidden zone. Normally the door was bolted shut, but today the heavy iron latch was not fully engaged. A sliver of dense, shadowy space separated the door from the jamb. Lord Vance was slipping. The exhaustion was eroding his iron discipline. For the past 48 hours, the pacing inside the map room had been manic, erratic. It lacked the steady, grim rhythm of a man searching. It was the heavy, stumbling footfall of a man suffocating in the dark. Ada paused her scrubbing. She sat back on her heels, the freezing pumice stone resting on her thigh. She listened. A sudden, violent crash shattered the heavy silence of the manor. It was the sound of a massive, solid wood drafting table being hurled violently against a stone wall. The impact rattled the floorboards beneath Ada's knees. Next came the sharp, terrible sound of a man's voice breaking. It wasn't a yell. It was a guttural, ragged gasp of absolute defeat. The heavy oak door was violently yanked open. It slammed against the stone wall, the hinges screaming. Lord Vance stormed out of the east wing. He was a terrifying sight. His white shirt was stained with black ink and sweat. His hair was wild, his gray eyes completely hollowed out, reduced to empty craters of despair. He didn't look at Ada. He didn't look at anything. He marched past her like a blind ghost, his heavy boots thudding down the main staircase. He was heading for the frozen courtyard. He needed air. He needed the biting cold to numb the failure in his brain. Ada remained frozen on the floor. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. The violent draft from the open door swept through the gallery. It caught the papers left fluttering in the wake of the Duke's rage. Heavy, expensive parchment sheets spilled out of the east wing, sliding across the frost-slicked stones, stopping inches from Ada's knees. She stared at them. The rule was absolute. Stay completely away from the east wing. Do not look. She picked up her pumice stone. She raised her hand to resume scrubbing the floor, but her eyes caught a thick black line drawn in ink on the paper closest to her boot. It was a cross-section drawing of a subterranean wall. Above it, written in sharp, precise architectural script, were the words, Eastern Shaft, Sector 4, Solid Granite Layer, Dead End. Ada's hand stopped in midair. Her heart slammed against her ribs. A cold, metallic taste flooded the back of her throat. Sector 4. The memory hit her with the physical force of a pickaxe. The smell of rotting earth, the suffocating heavy humidity of the deep tunnels, the agonizing burn of the iron brand pressing into her flesh. Silas had dragged her down into Sector 4 3 months ago. He had gripped her by the hair, dragging her through the black, knee-deep mud to show her what happened to people who talked. The ink on the Duke's map showed a solid wall of granite. A dead end. It was a lie. Ada knew it was a lie because she had bled behind that wall. It wasn't solid granite. It was a cleverly disguised, heavily reinforced timber bulkhead covered in crushed rock. Behind that false wall was a massive, cavernous hollow, a stolen vein. That was where Silas hoarded the crates of illegal blasting powder. That was where he stockpiled the silver ore he was skimming from the Blackwood Company. And the ventilation lines on the Duke's map were perfectly straight, indicating a clear, safe draft. Another lie. Ada remembered the heavy, suffocating pockets of natural gas trapped in the winding, unauthorized offshoot tunnels Silas had dug. The air down there didn't flow straight. It curled. It pooled. It waited for a single spark. Ada slowly lowered the pumice stone. She wiped her filthy, trembling hands on her coarse apron. The Duke wasn't failing because he wasn't smart enough. He was failing because the game board he was playing on was entirely fabricated. The official company ledgers, the surveyor maps, the safety reports, they were all forged by Silas and his corrupt foreman. They had handed the grieving Duke a map of a ghost mine, sending him endlessly chasing shadows in the wrong direction. Ada stared at the open door of the east wing. The black void inside was terrifying. It was a threshold of no return. She looked down at the lies drawn in expensive ink. Then she thought of the rope around her neck. She thought of the Duke's hollow, starving eyes. Ada stood up. She dropped the scrub brush into the frozen bucket. She didn't hesitate. She stepped over the threshold and walked into the forbidden room. The air inside the east wing was dead. It smelled of burnt tobacco, dried ink, and rotting paper. The room was a monument to a father's maddening obsession. Maps covered every inch of the stone walls, pinned haphazardly, layered over one another like peeling skin. Red strings connected arbitrary survey points. Desperation was nailed to the masonry. In the center of the room, the massive oak drafting table lay on its side, its surface gouged by whatever violence Lord Vance had unleashed upon it. Ada walked to the overturned table. She gripped the heavy, solid oak edge with her cracked hands. Her scarred shoulders protested instantly. The muscles in her back screamed as they pulled against the tight, puckered skin of her burns. She ignored the warning. She planted her bare feet firmly against the freezing flagstones, locked her knees, and heaved. The table slammed back onto its legs with a bone-jarring thud, settling heavily into the dust. She gathered the scattered maps from the floor. She smoothed the largest, heaviest parchment flat against the wood. Her dirty, calloused hands pressed the curling edges down. She stared at the intricate, perfectly drafted lines of the Blackwood mine. The clean blue ink was an insult to the men who had died in the filth. She needed to speak. She needed to scream the truth until the stone walls cracked, but her throat was a sealed tomb. Ada walked to the dead fireplace in the corner of the room. She knelt in the freezing gray ash. Her fingers sifted through the cold remnants of the Duke's frustrated fires. She found a thick, charred piece of pine, a makeshift stick of charcoal. It blackened her fingers instantly. It was the color of the deep tunnels. It was the color of the truth. She returned to the table. She stared at the surveyor's neat lines defining Sector 4. The printed words, solid granite, mocked her. Ada raised the charcoal. She pressed it hard against the expensive parchment. The burnt wood snapped under her heavy grip, but she held the jagged piece and kept drawing. She crossed out the words solid granite with violent, thick black strokes. She drew a harsh, jagged vertical line indicating the false timber bulkhead Silas had built. Then she began to map the darkness. Her hand did not move with the precision of an educated architect. It moved with the desperate, visceral memory of a prisoner. She drew the hidden, cavernous room behind the false wall. She shaded it in with furious, heavy smears of her thumb, pressing the coarse charcoal dust deep into the paper until it looked like a black, gaping wound on the map. This was the vault, the stolen silver, the illegal powder. Then she moved to the ventilation drafts. The neat blue ink showed straight arrows indicating safe, circulating air. Ada closed her eyes. She remembered the suffocating weight of the gas in those lower tunnels, the way it pooled invisibly near the damp floor, heavy and sweet-smelling, waiting patiently for a single spark. She opened her eyes and destroyed the blue arrows. She drew swirling, trapped pockets of dead air in the lower offshoot tunnels. She used her dirty fingernails to scrape away the ink where the surveyor claimed safety shafts existed, leaving raw, torn paper in its wake. She mapped the mine not as a source of wealth, but as the intricate, deadly weapon Silas had engineered. Her breathing grew shallow. Her chest tightened. The memories of Silas's heavy boots echoing in those exact tunnels threatened to drag her under. She could almost feel the heat of the branding iron hovering inches from her spine. She countered the rising panic with physical pressure. She pressed the charcoal harder, the dust mixed with the fresh blood seeping from the cracked skin on her knuckles. She was bleeding her trauma directly onto the map. She didn't stop at Sector 4. She moved across the vast layout of the entire subterranean network. She marked the unstable support beams in the western ridge, the ones the company ledgers swore were iron but she knew were rotting, waterlogged pine. She marked the hidden aquifers that constantly threatened to flood the lower shafts, which the foreman systematically bribed inspectors to ignore. Hours dissolved. The blizzard raged outside, rattling the frosted glass of the high windows. Ada didn't feel the biting cold anymore. She was entirely consumed by the silent translation of her suffering. Her hands were black to the wrists. Her apron was ruined with soot, sweat, and blood. Finally, she moved to the site of the explosive charge, the spot where the Duke's son had died. The official company report labeled it an accidental natural gas ignition. Ada knew the exact alcove where Silas had ordered the stolen blasting powder planted to trigger the collapse. She drew a stark, heavy black X over that specific hidden alcove. She circled it 3 times, the charcoal grinding into the parchment, nearly tearing through the heavy paper. She stepped back. The map was desecrated by aristocratic standards. It was a chaotic mess of black smears, jagged corrections, and bloody thumbprints. It looked violent. But for the first time in years, the map was honest. Ada dropped the tiny, worn-down nub of charcoal onto the table. It rolled with a quiet clatter and stopped against a silver inkwell. She looked down at her shaking hands. The adrenaline was rapidly fading, leaving behind only the biting chill of the room and the terrifying realization of what she had just done. She had destroyed the Duke's most prized possession. She had violated the single absolute law of her survival in this house. The punishment for this defiance would be severe. It would likely send her straight back to the gallows. Then she heard it. The heavy, unmistakable thud of Lord Vance's boots echoing on the stairs. He was coming back. The heavy boots stopped just outside the door. The brass handle turned slowly, a metallic groan echoing in the quiet room. Lord Vance stood in the doorway. Snow dusted his broad shoulders. His face was flushed from the biting cold, his chest heaving with exertion. He saw her. The stillness in the room shattered. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Ada didn't run. There was nowhere to run. She stood beside the drafting table, her hands hanging loosely at her sides, black with soot and slick with her own blood. "What have you done?" Vance's voice wasn't a yell. It was a low, dangerous growl that vibrated against the stone walls. It was the sound of a man pushed completely over the edge. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He didn't care that she was frail. He grabbed her upper arm. His grip was an iron vise, bruising her skin instantly. He jerked her violently away from the drafting table. Ada stumbled, her bare feet slipping on the dusty floor, but she bit her inside of her cheek, swallowing the gasp of pain. She refused to make a sound. "I gave you one rule," he hissed, his face inches from hers. He smelled of frost and bitter rage. "One rule." He shoved her aside. Ada hit the cold stone floor hard. Pain flared up her spine, but she scrambled to her knees, keeping her eyes locked on him. Vance turned to the table, ready to assess the damage to his life's work. He raised his hand to sweep the ruined parchment onto the floor. His hand stopped midair. He stared at the map. The chaotic, violent black smears of charcoal. The jagged lines cutting through the neat, blue ink of the surveyors. The bloodstains stamped into the heavy paper. The silence stretched. It pulled taut, tight as a piano wire. Vance leaned forward, bracing his massive hands on the edge of the oak table. His knuckles turned white. He didn't blink. He tracked the thick black line cutting through Sector 4. He read the words, solid granite brutally crossed out. He saw the dark, heavily shaded void she had drawn behind the false wall. The hidden vault. His eyes darted across the paper. He saw the swirling, trapped pockets of gas she had mapped in the lower tunnels. He saw the rotting support beams marked with jagged, desperate strokes. Then his gaze locked onto the heavy, dark X circled 3 times, the exact location where his son had burned to ash, the illegal blasting alcove. His breathing stopped. The violent rise and fall of his chest ceased entirely. He slowly lifted his right hand. He reached out and touched the X. His fingertip came away stained with black charcoal and a smear of fresh, bright red blood. Vance turned his head slowly. He looked down at Ada. She was still on her knees on the freezing floor. She was shivering, her chest rising and falling in shallow, terrified breaths, but her chin was up. Her dark eyes bored into his. She wasn't pleading for mercy. She was waiting for him to finally see the truth. He looked at her hands. The knuckles split open, the fingernails packed with soot. He looked at her shoulders. Through the thin, ruined fabric of her dress, he could see the raised, angry ridges of her burns, the explosion brand. The pieces finally snapped together in his mind with a deafening crack. She wasn't a murderer who had accidentally pushed her husband down a shaft. She was a witness. She was the only person alive who knew the architecture of Silas Thorne's lies. Silas hadn't just beaten her. He had systematically tortured her to ensure she never drew this exact map for anyone. The silence wasn't her illness. It was her prison sentence. And the map in front of him wasn't an act of vandalism. It was a rescue mission. The rage drained out of Vance completely, leaving behind a cold, terrifying clarity. The frantic, manic energy that had consumed him for years vanished. He stood up straight. He looked at the map again, then back down to her. He didn't offer her a hand. He didn't offer an apology. Gestures like that were useless in the void. Instead, he did something far more practical. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a clean, heavy linen handkerchief. He tossed it onto the floor in front of her bruised knees, an offering to bind her bleeding hands. "Get up," Vance said. His voice was entirely different now. The exhausted, hollow rattle was gone. It was replaced by the low, steady steel of a commander preparing for war. Ada picked up the handkerchief. She slowly rose to her feet, wrapping the linen tightly around her raw knuckles. Vance walked around the table. He stood directly in front of her. He looked at her, not as a servant, but as the only solid thing left in his house. "Sector 4, he said softly, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "It's not a dead end, it's a vault." Ada gave a single firm nod. "And Silas." Vance's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking in his cheek. "Silas isn't at the bottom of the main shaft. He's hiding behind that false wall." Ada nodded again. The Duke turned his gaze toward the frosted window. The blizzard was still raging outside, but the internal storm that had been tearing the manor apart had finally broken. "We need lanterns," Vance stated, his voice devoid of any doubt. "And we need iron crowbars. We are going into the dark." The preparation was a silent, synchronized ritual of war. There were no grand speeches. The void did not tolerate useless words. They moved to the manor's heavy iron supply locker in the cellar. Vance tossed her a thick, wool-lined canvas coat. It was too large, swallowing her frail frame, but it was incredibly warm. She put it on. He handed her a pair of heavy leather work boots. She tied the thick laces tight, relishing the solid, protective weight around her battered ankles. Vance strapped a heavy gun belt to his waist. The iron buckle clicked sharply in the quiet room. He loaded a Colt revolver with methodical, deadly precision. Click, spin, click. He slid it into the holster. He turned and handed Etta a heavy iron crowbar. It was cold and rough. She gripped it with her bandaged hands. It felt like justice. They stepped out into the raging blizzard. The wind shrieked, tearing at their coats, trying to push them back into the tomb of the manor. They leaned into the gale. They walked shoulder to shoulder. The entrance to the Blackwood mine was a jagged black scar cut into the side of the ironwood ridge. As they crossed the threshold, the howling wind died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. The temperature shifted from biting frost to a damp, bone-chilling cold. The smell hit Ada first. Stale earth, rotting pine, sulfur. Her lungs seized, her vision blurred at the edges. The phantoms of the deep tunnels rushed up to greet her. She could hear the echo of Silas's laughter. She could feel the searing heat of the branding iron hovering near her spine. She stopped, her breathing turning into rapid, shallow gasps. Her hands shook violently around the heavy iron crowbar. Vance stopped a few paces ahead. He turned around. He raised his lantern, the yellow light casting long, harsh shadows against the jagged rock walls. He saw the sheer, paralyzing terror locking her joints. He didn't offer comforting words. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He knew those were lies. He walked back to her. He stood directly in her line of sight, blocking out the darkness of the tunnel ahead. He reached out and wrapped his massive, gloved hand over her trembling fingers gripping the crowbar. He squeezed firmly, grounding her. "I am here," Vance said. The rumble of his voice was low, vibrating through the damp air. "He is just a man, and today he is a dead man. Lead the way." He released her hand. The panic receded, slowly replaced by the heavy, familiar numbness of survival. Ada nodded. She stepped in front of him. She became the guide. The descent was treacherous. The official tunnels were wide and heavily timbered, but Ada led him away from the main shafts. She guided him into the older, abandoned veins. The paths were narrow, the ceilings terrifyingly low. Water dripped constantly, a maddening, rhythmic sound in the dark. They walked for an hour, 2, deeper into the earth. The air grew thinner. Suddenly, Ada threw her arm back, slamming her forearm directly against Vance's chest to stop him. Vance froze. He didn't question her. He didn't speak. Ada pointed to the floor. She knelt. She reached into the muddy water pooling in the broken mine tracks and scooped a handful of muck. She tossed it a few feet ahead. The mud hit the ground without a sound, but a faint, hazy ripple disturbed the air just above the floorboards. The smell was faint, but distinctly sweet. Natural gas. A pooling pocket, heavy and invisible, trapped in a dead air dip. If Vance had walked through it with his open flame lantern swinging low, the entire tunnel would have incinerated in a split second. Ada stood up. She pointed to a narrow, jagged fissure climbing up the right side of the tunnel wall, a ventilation bypass. She pointed to herself, then to the fissure. She began to climb the slick, sharp rocks. Vance understood. He raised his lantern high, keeping the flame well above the invisible pool of death, and followed her up into the tight crevice. They squeezed through the rock, the sharp granite tearing at their heavy coats. When they dropped back down onto solid ground on the other side of the gas pocket, Vance looked back at the death trap they had just bypassed. He looked at Ada. He gave a single rigid nod of absolute respect. They pushed forward. The air grew heavier, thick, with the smell of old timber and moisture. Finally, the tunnel widened. The track ended abruptly. Directly in front of them stood a massive wall of what appeared to be solid, impenetrable rock and packed earth. Sector 4. The dead end on the official map. Ada stepped forward. She raised her crowbar and tapped the iron tip against the center of the wall. Thud. Thud. It didn't ring like solid rock. It echoed with the hollow, distinct sound of thick timber hidden just beneath the dirt. They had found the vault. Vance stepped beside her. He ran his thick, gloved hand over the damp, packed earth. His fingers traced the subtle, unnatural seams where the dirt was artificially pressed deep into the heavy timber grain. He stepped back, unhooked his heavy brass lantern, and set it carefully on a flat, protruding stone. He didn't draw his gun. He simply held out his hand. Ada surrendered the heavy iron crowbar. Vance raised the iron high above his shoulder. He brought it down with the terrifying kinetic force of a father's unbroken, suffocating grief. Crack. The false rock shattered. Clumps of dried mud, gray dust, and crushed slate cascaded to the damp floorboards. Underneath the camouflage, thick, heavily treated pine boards were exposed to the light. Vance swung again. Crack. The aged wood splintered sharply. He didn't stop. He swung with a relentless mechanical brutality. Every violent strike was a year of endless pacing in the dark. Every shattered splinter was a forged company document finally torn apart. The heavy rhythmic sound of iron destroying wood echoed down the abandoned tunnel, deafening and absolute. Ada stood back in the shadows, watching the physical manifestation of his vengeance. The confined air quickly filled with choking, bitter dust. With a final roaring heave, Vance drove the wedge tip of the heavy crowbar deep into the center seam of the bulkhead and ripped his entire weight backward. The thick timber groaned in protest, snapped violently, and completely gave way. A massive section of the false wall collapsed inward, crashing heavily into the pitch-black void beyond. A foul, stale draft rushed out of the jagged opening. Vance dropped the crowbar. It clanged sharply against the solid rock. He picked up his lantern and stepped to the broken threshold. He thrust the yellow light forward. Ada moved silently to his side. They peered into the darkness together. It wasn't a dead end. It was a massive, heavily shored subterranean cavern. The flickering light of the lantern caught the sharp, distinct metallic gleam of stacked iron crates, the illegal blasting powder. Beyond them, lined up meticulously like coffins in the dark, were heavy wooden boxes bearing the official Blackwood Company seal, the stolen silver. And sitting on a rough-hewn table in the very center of the hidden room, barely illuminated by the sudden intrusion of their light, was a single kerosene lamp burning extremely low. The kerosene smell was pungent and fresh. The glass chimney was undeniably warm. Someone had been here recently. Someone was still down here in the dark. Act 3 was over. The hunt had officially begun. The heavy air inside the vault was stagnant, thick with the metallic, suffocating smell of absolute greed. Lord Vance stepped through the splintered remains of the false bulkhead, his lantern held high above his head. Ada followed close behind, her heavy boots making no sound on the damp, uneven stone. The cavern was massive. It was an illicit cathedral carved directly out of the mountain's heart by men who had sold their souls for silver. Stacks of iron-banded crates lined the eastern wall, stacked 10 feet high. Vance walked toward them, wiping the dust from the stencil on the nearest crate. Blackwood Mining, high-yield blasting powder. It was the exact grade of explosive banned by the Territory Safety Commission due to its unstable nature. The exact type of powder that had vaporized his son's crew. To the west sat the true motive. Dozens of heavy reinforced wooden lockboxes lined up perfectly in the dark. All of them bore the freshly burned seal of the Blackwood Mining Company. Vance set his lantern down on a flat, protruding rock. He drew his heavy hunting knife and wedged the steel blade under the iron latch of the closest lockbox. He slammed his palm against the pommel. The lock snapped with a sharp crack. He threw the heavy wooden lid back. Raw, unrefined silver ore gleamed dully in the shifting yellow light. It was a king's ransom, bled illegally from the Duke's own veins, ounce by ounce. Resting carefully on top of the jagged ore was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Vance picked it up. He opened it, bringing it close to the lantern glass. The handwriting was meticulous, neat, and instantly recognizable to Ada. It was Silas's handwriting. The pages were filled with columns of illicit transactions, delivery dates, and specific bribe amounts. The ledger named the town's sheriff. It named the magistrate who had condemned Ada. The entire town of Blackwood Creek was complicit. They were all drowning in Silas Thorne's blood money. Vance stared at the neat, black ink. His jaw locked so tightly the muscle ticked violently beneath his scarred cheek. The truth was no longer a theory scrawled in charcoal. It was a physical weight in his hands. "He didn't just murder my son," Vance whispered. The sound was hollow, completely stripped of all aristocratic restraint. "He built an entire empire on his bones." Ada didn't look at the silver. She didn't look at the ledger. She was staring at the ceiling. Her survival instincts, honed sharp by years of domestic torture, were suddenly screaming. She felt the shift before she heard it. A sudden, sharp drop in the subterranean air pressure. The fine hairs on the back of her neck stood up perfectly straight. The flame inside Vance's lantern flickered violently, pulled toward the broken entrance they had just stepped through. A draft, but not a natural one. It was the sudden mechanical suction of air that always preceded a massive ignition. Ada lunged. She grabbed the heavy wool collar of Vance's canvas coat and yanked backward with every ounce of terrified strength she possessed. Vance stumbled back just as the sound hit them. It wasn't a roar. It was a physical, crushing blow. A deafening, bone-shattering detonation erupted in the main tunnel directly behind them. The concussive wave slammed into the vault like a solid iron fist, throwing Ada violently to the floor. The lantern shattered on the stone, plunging them instantly into absolute pitch-black darkness. The mountain screamed in agony. Tons of solid granite and heavy timber rained down in the tunnel outside, crushing the false wall completely. The ground heaved violently beneath Ada's chest. She curled into a tight, defensive ball, her hands covering the back of her neck, choking as a dense, suffocating cloud of pulverized rock and bitter sulfur flooded the cavern. The violent, deafening trembling lasted for 30 agonizing seconds. Then, the falling rocks slowed. The roar subsided into a terrifying, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of small pebbles trickling down the newly formed barricade. The dust was so thick it coated Ada's throat, forcing a harsh, painful cough from her lungs. "Ada!" Vance's voice cut through the impenetrable dark. It was close, steady, unbroken. She felt his heavy leather glove brush against her shoulder. He found her arm and pulled her upright. She leaned against the cold stone wall, trying to pull oxygen through the choking dust. A sharp scrape of metal echoed. A spark flared. Vance had struck a sulfur match against the stone. The tiny, fragile yellow flame pushed back the suffocating darkness just enough to reveal the absolute devastation. The entrance was completely gone. Where the splintered bulkhead had been seconds ago, there was now a solid, towering wall of jagged granite slabs and crushed timber. They were sealed inside the vault. Millions of tons of rock separated them from the surface. The trap had been sprung. Vance held the dying match up. The heavy timber supports inside the cavern were groaning audibly under the sudden shift in the mountain's immense weight. Dust rained down continuously from the cracked ceiling. The match burned down to Vance's thick leather glove. He didn't flinch. He let the flame die out completely. In the renewed, suffocating darkness, a sound echoed from the far, unseen corner of the massive vault. Click. It was the distinct, crisp, metallic sound of a revolver hammer being pulled back. "I have to say, Your Grace," a voice drawled casually from the blackness. It was smooth, arrogant, and dripping with venom. "I didn't think the mute bitch had the brains to bring you all the way down here. I guess I didn't hit her quite hard enough." Ada's blood turned to solid ice. Silas. Silas struck a sulfur match against the rough stone. The sudden, violent flare of yellow light illuminated his face. He didn't look like a man who had fallen down a mine shaft. His clothes were unsoiled. He wore a thick wool coat and expensive polished leather boots. He lit the wick of a heavy brass bullseye lantern, turning the focused, blinding beam directly into their faces. Vance squinted, raising a gloved hand to shield his eyes. Ada didn't move. The light pinned her against the cavern wall like a specimen on a board. "Put the gun down, Silas," Vance said. His voice was a flat, dead calm. It was the heavy rumble of a rock slide waiting to happen. Silas laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound that echoed terribly in the enclosed space. "I don't think I will, Your Grace. Not when I'm holding all the cards. And all the silver." Silas stepped forward, staying carefully out of lunging distance. The lantern beam cut sharply through the swirling, choking dust. He pointed the barrel of the Colt revolver directly at Vance's chest, but his eyes, cold and entirely predatory, slid over to Ada. "Look at her," Silas sneered. "I dragged her out of the gutters of Blackwood Creek. I fed her. I put a roof over her head. And what did she do? She just watched. Always watching with those dead, empty eyes, never making a sound. It drove a man mad, Your Grace. You understand, don't you? Living with a ghost?" Ada's breathing turned incredibly shallow. The smell of his cheap pomade mixed with the bitter sulfur in the air. It was the exact smell of the nights she spent locked in the dark cellar. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She forced herself to press her bandaged knuckles violently against the jagged stone wall behind her. The sharp, tearing pain flared. Pain was reality. Pain kept her anchored. Pain kept her from drowning in the memory. "She's a broken, useless thing," Silas continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I had to discipline her. You know how it is with wild animals, you have to break the spirit completely so they learn their place. I burned the silence into her skin so deep I figured she'd take it straight to the grave. But here she is, still causing trouble." Vance did not look at Ada. He kept his gaze locked entirely on Silas. He didn't rise to the bait. He stood loosely, his arms hanging casually at his sides, his right hand hovering mere inches from his own holstered weapon. "You blew the main tunnel," Vance stated, ignoring the rant about Ada entirely. "You trapped us. But you trapped yourself, too. Unless you've spent the last 3 years digging like a rat." Silas grinned. The lantern light caught the flash of a gold filling in his teeth. "I'm a foreman, Lord Vance. I know the dirt better than God. There's a natural fissure directly behind the eastern powder stack. Leads straight up to a secondary ventilation shaft. It's narrow, but it breathes." He gestured with the heavy revolver, pacing slowly behind the impenetrable wall of silver crates. "Here is the reality of your situation, Duke," Silas said, dropping the mock respect. "You have nothing. Your ledgers are buried. Your estate is freezing. Your son is dust. I won." Silas stopped pacing. He aimed the lantern beam directly at Ada again. She squeezed her eyes shut against the blinding glare. "But I'm a businessman," Silas offered smoothly. "I don't need to kill a duke. That brings the Pinkertons. That brings the territorial army. So let's make a trade." He leveled the gun perfectly at Vance's head. "You leave the silver. You leave the ledger on the table. I point you to the fissure, and you walk out of here alive. You go back to your cold, empty manor and pretend none of this happened." Silas shifted the gun barrel, pointing it straight at Ada's chest. The metallic click of the cylinder locking into place echoed sharply. "But the bitch stays," Silas spat, his voice dropping into a vicious, guttural snarl. "She belongs to me. She's stolen property. I'm going to chain her to this wall and let the mountains starve her to death." "That's the price of your ticket out, Vance. The mute for your life." The ultimatum hung heavily in the choking air. Silas was trying to sever the invisible thread that bound them. He fully expected the aristocrat to do what aristocrats always did, sacrifice the peasantry to save their own skin. Ada opened her eyes. The blinding light burned her retinas, but she forced herself to look at Vance. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. Crying didn't stop a bullet. She simply waited for the cold, logical execution of their forced arrangement to end. She was a tool that had served its purpose. She had guided him to the truth. Now she was expendable. Vance slowly turned his head. He looked at Ada. He saw the violent trembling she was trying so desperately to suppress. He saw the bloody bandages wrapping her raw hands. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in her dark eyes, completely masked by a wall of absolute silent resignation. The silence stretched. The dust settled on their shoulders like gray snow. The heavy timber beams above them groaned ominously. Silas chuckled, sensing an easy victory. Make the smart choice, Your Grace. She isn't worth the bullet it would take to put you down. Silas's ultimatum hung in the stagnant air, thick and foul. He was offering the oldest trade in the world, a woman's life for a man's convenience. Ada kept her eyes fixed on Vance's broad back. She knew the mechanics of survival. She knew that when a cornered animal is offered an exit, it takes it. She expected Vance to nod. She expected him to lower his hand from his gun belt, turn around and walk into the narrow ventilation fissure, leaving her chained to the rock. It was the logical choice. It was the only choice. But Vance did not move. He stared down the barrel of Silas's heavy revolver. The Duke's gray eyes were entirely devoid of fear. The hollow, starving man who had paced the freezing floors of Blackwood Manor was gone. In his place stood a man completely forged in iron and absolute certainty. Vance slowly shifted his stance, grounding his heavy leather boots into the crushed slate. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't bargain. "You misunderstand the arrangement, Thorne," Vance said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated against the damp cavern walls. It carried no aristocratic inflection. It was raw, brutal dirt. Silas's smug grin faltered slightly. The lantern beam trembled in his grip. "Excuse me?" "You think you hold the power because you have the light and the gun," Vance continued, taking a single deliberate step forward. The gravel crunched loudly beneath his heel. "But you are standing in a tomb of your own making." Silas tightened his finger on the trigger. "Take another step, Duke, and I'll put a hole in your chest." Vance didn't stop. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked Silas dead in the eye and delivered the absolute final verdict. "She stays," Vance stated softly. "You leave." Silas's face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "Then you both burn!" He swung the barrel of the Colt aggressively toward Vance's center mass. Ada did not freeze. The cold resignation shattered inside her, instantly replaced by a violent, desperate will to live. She didn't have a voice to scream a warning, but she had her body. She knew the exact geometry of the room. She knew where the heavy iron crowbar lay in the rubble beside her boots. She dropped to the freezing stone floor with bone-bruising force. Her raw, bandaged hands blindly found the cold iron. She gripped it tight. She didn't aim for Silas. Silas was too far away and the heavy coat would absorb a blunt impact. She aimed for the source of his control. She aimed for the light. With a guttural, silent heave, Ada hurled the iron crowbar across the cavern. Her branded shoulders screamed in agony, the tight scar tissue pulling violently, but she threw her entire body weight behind the iron. The crowbar spun through the heavy air. It struck the heavy brass bullseye lantern with a devastating metallic crash. The thick glass shattered. The kerosene spilled over the stone and instantly flared into a bright, violent blue fireball before sputtering out completely. Absolute suffocating darkness slammed back into the vault. A split second later, the Colt roared. The muzzle flash was a blinding, jagged stroke of lightning in the pitch black. The deafening crack of the gunshot in the enclosed cavern was a physical blow to the eardrums. The concussive wave vibrated through Ada's chest. The bullet struck the stone wall precisely where Vance had been standing a fraction of a second before, sending sharp shrapnel flying into the dark. But Vance wasn't there. He had lunged the instant the lantern shattered. Ada rolled hard to the left, scrambling over the sharp, broken slate on her hands and knees. The darkness was total. She was entirely blind, but she knew the terrain of terror perfectly. She pressed her back flat against the cold, damp rock of the cavern wall, making herself as small as possible. She held her breath until her lungs burned. In the center of the room, the struggle was entirely auditory and intensely violent. There was the heavy, sickening thud of a fist striking solid bone, a grunt of sudden, sharp pain, the frantic, chaotic scuffle of heavy boots slipping on the loose gravel. Silas fired wildly again. Bang! The muzzle flash illuminated nothing but swirling, thick dust and the terrifying silhouette of two massive men locked in a brutal embrace. The bullet ricocheted off one of the iron powder crates with a high-pitched, deadly whine. Vance did not draw his own weapon. Firing blindly in the pitch black was a fool's gamble. A stray bullet could strike Ada, or worse, spark the massive stack of highly unstable blasting powder just feet away. He used his bare hands. He used the sheer physical weight of his grief. "Get off me, you aristocratic son of a bitch!" Silas screamed in the dark. The arrogant drawl was entirely gone, replaced by sudden, genuine panic. A heavy crash followed. Someone was thrown violently backward into the wall of wooden lockboxes. The heavy silver ore spilled onto the stone floor with a loud, chaotic clatter. Ada stayed perfectly still against the wall. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. She tracked the fight through the vibrations in the floorboards. She felt the heavy thuds. She smelled the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood mixing with the bitter ozone of burnt gunpowder. She heard Silas gasp, a wet, restricted gurgling sound. Vance had him by the throat. "The Fisher," Vance snarled in the black void. He was a beast operating purely on survival. "Where is it?" "Go to hell," Silas choked out. A sharp metallic scrape cut through the dark, a switchblade opening. Silas wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to bleed the Duke out. Ada realized Silas was backing up. The scuffle was moving toward the eastern wall, toward the iron crates. If Silas blindly fired his gun again, or if his blade struck the iron bands and sparked, the entire cavern would vaporize. She had to intervene. She had to use the dark. The darkness was Silas's enemy, but it was Ada's oldest companion. She had spent 3 years locked in windowless cellars and unlit mine shafts. She knew how to breathe without making a sound. She knew how to map a room entirely by the subtle shifts in the air currents and the temperature of the stone. The violent struggle in the center of the vault was moving eastward, toward the iron-banded crates, toward the unstable blasting powder. Ada didn't hesitate. She reached down and hastily untied the thick laces of her heavy leather boots. She slipped them off. She needed absolute ghostly silence. Her bare, blistered feet touched the freezing, jagged slate. The sharp rocks instantly cut into her soles, but she bit her lip, welcoming the sharp, grounding pain. She pushed away from the wall. She moved in a low crouch, sweeping the ground gently with her raw hands to clear the loose gravel before taking a step. She was a shadow moving within a void. 10 feet away, the fight grew incredibly vicious. "I'll gut you, Vance!" Silas screamed. His voice was laced with hysterical panic. He was blindly swiping the switchblade through the heavy air. Rip. The sickening sound of heavy canvas tearing was followed by a sharp hiss of pain from Vance. Silas's blade had found flesh. Vance didn't retreat. He lunged into the cut, driving his massive shoulder directly into Silas's chest. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer hitting wet meat. Silas wheezed. stumbling backward wildly. His heavy boots scraped desperately against the stone floor. Clang! Silas's back slammed hard against the towering stack of iron crates. The impact rattled the highly unstable blasting powder inside. Ada froze mid-step. Her heart stopped. One spark. If Silas fired the Colt now, or if his steel blade struck the iron banding in the dark, the entire mountain would vaporize. "Get back!" Silas shrieked, the raw terror in his voice echoing sharply. He raised the heavy revolver, aiming blindly into the black space in front of him. His finger panicked against the trigger guard. He didn't care about the powder anymore. He just wanted the Duke dead. Ada was less than 3 feet behind him. She could smell his sweat. She could feel the erratic, terrified heat radiating off his body. She didn't look for a weapon on the ground. She didn't have time. She used the only advantage she possessed, her intimate knowledge of his physical cruelty. Silas had an old mining injury, a shattered right kneecap from a localized cave-in years ago. He hid a slight limp, but Ada knew exactly how he favored it when he stood, how the joint would lock and buckle if struck from the side. She had spent hours scrubbing the mud off that exact boot. Ada dropped low. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the consequences. She threw her entire body weight forward, driving her shoulder and elbow with brutal, kinetic force directly into the side of Silas's bad knee. Crack. The sound of the weak joint giving way was sickeningly loud. Silas shrieked, a high, piercing wail of absolute, unadulterated agony. His leg collapsed completely underneath him. The sudden, violent drop threw his aim wildly off balance. Bang! The Colt fired as he fell. The muzzle flash illuminated the vault for a blinding fraction of a second. The bullet hit the high ceiling, sending a shower of harmless dust raining down. In that split second of light, Vance saw his opening. Before the darkness could fully swallow the room again, Vance launched himself forward. He descended on the falling man like an avalanche of iron and grief. Vance's heavy boot slammed down directly onto Silas's wrist. The bone snapped with a sharp crack. Silas screamed again, his fingers opening involuntarily. The heavy Colt revolver clattered uselessly across the stone floor, sliding away into the dark. Vance didn't stop. He dropped his massive weight onto Silas's chest, pinning him completely to the ground. His large gloved hands found the collar of Silas's coat, twisting the heavy fabric brutally tight against the man's windpipe. "You don't get to die in the flash," Vance snarled, his voice a terrifying low vibration in the pitch black. The Duke was bleeding from a deep gash on his arm, but he didn't feel it. "You get to die in the dirt." Silas thrashed violently, his left hand clawing desperately at Vance's face, but the Duke was an immovable mountain of stone. Vance shifted his weight, pressing his forearm ruthlessly against Silas's throat, cutting off his air supply entirely. The thrashing began to slow. The arrogant, untouchable foreman of Blackwood Creek was drowning on dry land. The wet, desperate gurgles of his suffocating breaths filled the heavy silence of the vault. Ada knelt in the dark, her bare, bleeding feet tucked beneath her. Her chest heaved in ragged, silent gasps. She listened to the sound of her abuser being broken. She felt no pity. She felt no triumph. She only felt the crushing, exhausting weight of survival. "Vance," a voice croaked weakly. Silas was begging. The fissure." Vance eased the pressure on his windpipe just enough to let a thin sliver of air pass. "Tell me," Vance commanded. Behind the silver," Silas gasped, coughing up blood. "Move the middle crates." Vance did not let him go. He kept his knee planted firmly on Silas's chest. The physical threat was neutralized, the antagonist was broken, but the stand was not over. They were still trapped in a suffocating tomb, and the air was growing dangerously thin. Vance did not snap his neck. Death in the dark was a sudden mercy Silas did not deserve. He deserved the blinding, humiliating light of the gallows. Vance stood up. The darkness was absolute. He reached down, grabbed Silas by the collar of his expensive wool coat, and dragged his broken body across the rough slate. Silas groaned, a pathetic, wet sound. Vance slammed him unceremoniously against the solid rock wall. Vance unbuckled his heavy leather gun belt. He didn't need the holster anymore. He wrapped the thick hide tightly around Silas's wrists, pulling the heavy brass buckle brutally tight over the freshly broken bone. Silas shrieked, a high, reedy sound before passing out entirely from the blinding pain. The vault fell completely, terrifyingly silent. "Ada!" Vance's voice was a low, steady rumble in the void. He didn't shout. He knew she was there. Ada stood up. Her bare, bleeding feet throbbed against the freezing floor. She moved toward his voice, her hands outstretched in the pitch black until her bandaged fingertips brushed the heavy, torn canvas of his coat. She grasped the fabric. She was there. "The middle crates," Vance breathed, his chest heaving from the exertion and the thin air. They moved together. There was no light to guide them, only the desperate, tactile necessity of physical labor. They blindly felt their way to the heavy wooden lockboxes filled with stolen silver. They didn't care about the wealth inside. To them, it was just dead weight. It was just an obstacle blocking the air. Vance planted his boots. Ada pressed her bruised shoulders against the wood. They pushed. Their combined weight strained against the massive boxes. The wood scraped agonizingly across the stone floor. 1 foot, 2 feet. Then she felt it. A sharp, biting current of freezing air sliced across Ada's face. It didn't smell like sulfur, kerosene, or rotting earth. It smelled like sharp pine needles. It smelled like the violent, raging blizzard above. It was the fissure. It was a physical path back to the world of the living. Vance reached into the dark. He didn't grab her arm this time. His heavy, gloved hand found the side of her face. He rested his palm briefly against her cheek, his thumb brushing her jawline. A single grounding touch in the absolute black, a silent, profound acknowledgement of the life she had just saved. He let his hand drop. He bent down and hoisted the unconscious, broken weight of Silas Thorne over his broad, injured shoulder. He picked up the leather-bound ledger with his free hand. The indisputable truth. "We climb," Vance commanded softly. Ada stepped into the freezing draft. She didn't look back at the vault. She gripped the jagged rocks of the narrow fissure and began to climb toward the storm. The climb was an agonizing, vertical crawl through the jagged throat of the mountain. The air grew steadily colder, biting into their lungs like crushed glass. Ada led the way, pulling herself upward over the sharp, freezing granite. Her bare feet left bloody prints on the frost-covered stone, but the pain was distant. The physical world was secondary to the sheer, desperate need for the sky. Below her, Vance climbed with the agonizing dead weight of Silas Thorne slung over his bleeding shoulder. He moved like a machine built of pure, unyielding iron. He didn't slip. He didn't falter. He carried the architect of his son's death out of the dark. They breached the surface just as the dawn broke over the ironwood ridge. The blizzard had finally died. The sky was a pale, bruised purple, giving way to a harsh, blinding winter sun. The freezing air hit Ada like a physical blow. She collapsed onto her knees in the deep, pristine snow. She greedily pulled the agonizingly cold, fresh air into her lungs. It didn't smell like sulfur. It didn't smell like the grave. It smelled like nothing. It was the best thing she had ever breathed. Vance hauled himself over the lip of the fissure a moment later. He dumped Silas unceremoniously into a snowbank. The foreman groaned weakly, his broken wrist hanging at a grotesque angle. Vance didn't collapse. He stood perfectly straight, his chest heaving. His white shirt was soaked in blood from the knife wound, his heavy coat covered in black soot and gray dust. He looked down at Ada. He reached into his deep pocket, pulled out the heavy leather ledger, and tucked it safely inside his coat. They didn't rest. The void was behind them, but the reckoning was waiting in the valley. The walk down the mountain to the mining town of Blackwood Creek took 3 hours. Ada wrapped her frozen, bleeding feet in torn strips of her coarse apron. She walked beside the Duke in absolute silence. It was mid-morning when they reached the town square. The same square where, just a month ago, the townspeople had spat at Ada's feet as she was dragged to the gallows. The town was awake. Miners were trudging toward the main road. The grocer was sweeping his icy steps. The sheriff stood outside the magistrate's office, drinking hot coffee from a tin cup, laughing at a joke the yellow-toothed magistrate had just made. Then they saw the Duke. The laughter died instantly. The sweeping stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the snowy street. Lord Vance did not ride in on a horse. He walked down the center of the muddy street, dragging Silas Thorne by the collar of his coat through the freezing slush. Ada walked 1 pace behind him, a silent, terrifying ghost returning from the dead. Vance stopped directly in front of the magistrate's office. He heaved his massive shoulder and threw Silas violently onto the wooden boardwalk. Silas hit the planks with a sickening thud, coughing up a mixture of blood and snow directly onto the sheriff's polished boots. The sheriff panicked. He dropped his coffee cup. It clattered loudly, spilling dark liquid over the snow. His hand twitched toward the heavy revolver on his hip. "I wouldn't," Vance said. The rumble of his voice was low, exhausted, but laced with a lethal, absolute authority. Vance reached inside his coat. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled out the heavy, leather-bound ledger. He tossed it onto the wooden boardwalk. It landed with a heavy smack right beside Silas's broken hand. "The silver is buried in Sector 4, Vance stated, his gray eyes sweeping over the pale, terrified faces of the magistrate and the sheriff. "The blasting powder is stacked next to it. And every single bribe, every blind eye, every false safety report that buried my son is written in that book." The magistrate's yellow skin turned the color of old ash. He stared at the ledger like it was a live rattlesnake. He knew his name was in there. The sheriff slowly raised his hands, moving them carefully away from his gun belt. The townspeople began to gather, forming a tight, anxious ring around the boardwalk. These were the same people who had called Ada a witch, the same people who had testified against her. Vance turned his head and looked at the crowd. The contempt in his eyes was absolute. "He didn't act alone," Vance's voice echoed off the wooden storefronts. "He bought this town with my silver. He bought your silence. He bought a noose for a woman who couldn't speak just to protect his vault." Vance stepped back. He looked down at Silas, then back to the sheriff. "The Pinkertons are in the capital. They will be here by tomorrow morning," Vance declared. The words were a death sentence. "I suggest you lock him up. Then I suggest you lock yourselves up. Because if I find any of you within 50 miles of my territory when the sun sets, I won't need a ledger to bury you." The reckoning was entirely cold. No bullets were fired. No shouts were raised. The corrupt men were simply crushed by the heavy, undeniable weight of their own documented sins. The town mob retreated. They stepped back into the shadows of their storefronts, humiliated, terrified, and utterly silent. They could not meet Ada's eyes. Ada stood on the freezing street. She looked at the grocer. She looked at the magistrate. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt tired. The cage they had built for her was finally broken, but she had no desire to linger in its ruins. Vance turned away from the boardwalk. He didn't look back at the men whose lives he had just destroyed. He looked at Ada. "Let's go home," he said quietly. The next morning, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency arrived in Blackwood Creek. They rode in on heavily armored rail cars, their silver badges catching the pale, biting winter sun. They didn't come to negotiate. They came with heavy iron shackles and federal warrants based entirely on the detailed ledger Lord Vance had surrendered. Silas Thorne was dragged from the local jail. His broken knee was untreated, his shattered wrist swollen black and purple. He was thrown into the back of an iron-barred prison wagon, screaming threats that no one listened to anymore. The sheriff was stripped of his tin badge and marched out beside him, his hands bound in heavy iron. The magistrate was found trembling in his office, his packed suitcases sitting uselessly by the door. The town of Blackwood Creek was surgically gutted of its rot. The miners, the ones who had swung pickaxes for Silas and spat at Ada's feet, were left to face the sudden, terrifying vacuum of authority. They watched the prison wagons roll out of the valley in absolute cowardly silence. They had traded their morality for silver, and now they had neither. They lowered their eyes, terrified the mute widow would demand their heads, but Ada didn't care about revenge against sheep. They were entirely insignificant. Miles above the town, Blackwood Manor stood against the jagged peaks of the Ironwood Ridge. As the carriage carrying Lord Vance and Ada passed through the heavy iron gates, the oppressive weight of the estate felt fundamentally altered. It was still a fortress of gray stone. The wind still howled off the mountains, but it was no longer a tomb. The ghost that had haunted its halls was finally at rest. The aftermath of survival was not a sudden burst of warmth or laughter. Trauma did not evaporate. It settled. It scarred over. Mrs. Higgins met them at the heavy oak doors. For the first time, the severe housekeeper's stoic mask slipped. She saw the Duke's blood-soaked shirt. She saw Ada's raw, frost-bitten feet and ruined hands. Mrs. Higgins did not ask questions. She simply turned and began boiling water, tearing clean linen into thick bandages and preparing the harsh lye soap. The physical healing was slow, silent, and deeply practical. Ada sat on a wooden stool in the warm kitchen while Mrs. Higgins scrubbed the dirt and dried blood from her torn feet. The hot water stung viciously. Ada bit the inside of her cheek, but she didn't pull away. It was honest pain. It was the pain of mending, not breaking. Lord Vance refused a doctor. He sat by the kitchen hearth, his torn shirt discarded, pouring harsh, biting whiskey directly over the deep knife wound on his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, his jaw locked tight against the burning agony. Ada watched him. He wasn't starving himself anymore. The hollow, manic energy in his gray eyes had completely vanished, replaced by a bone-deep, heavy exhaustion. He was a man who had finally finished a brutal 10-year war. The rhythm of the house slowly returned, but the rules of the forced arrangement were permanently broken. Ada still woke before dawn. She still went to the woodpile. The axe was still heavy. She raised it. She brought it down. Crack. The wood split. But the frantic, desperate need to outrun her memories was gone. She was no longer building a wall between herself and the past. She was simply chopping wood to warm a house she lived in. The sanctuary of chores remained, but it was no longer a frantic escape. She kneaded the thick bread dough, push down, fold over, turn. Her knuckles, wrapped in clean white linen, no longer bled into the flour. The most profound shift, however, happened in the dead of night. Ada lay on her pile of wool in the scullery. The freezing drafts were gone, blocked entirely by the heavy burlap excluders she had woven. She listened to the ceiling above her. She waited for the heavy rhythmic thud of the Duke's boots. She waited for the sound of a caged wolf going mad in the dark. It never came. The heavy oak door to the east wing, the map room, was left wide open. The chaotic, blood-stained maps had been torn down from the walls and burned in the great hall's massive hearth. The ashes were swept away. The room was just a room. Lord Vance slept. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of his guilt had been lifted. He had found the truth. He had buried the monsters. The mountain had taken his son, but it would no longer take his life. The silence in the manor was no longer heavy and suffocating. It was simply the quiet peace of a house that had finally stopped holding its breath. Ada no longer felt like a ghost haunting the halls. She was a physical, breathing entity occupying space without the constant, terrifying fear of retribution. The thaw came late to Blackwood Creek, but the ice inside the manor had already begun to crack. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the only sound was the crackle of dry pine in the massive hearths. Ada finished her work in the kitchens. Her hands, though permanently scarred and deeply calloused, no longer bled. The thick, puckered burns across her back still pulled tightly when she reached high, but the phantom heat of the branding iron was gone. She wiped her hands on her clean apron and walked toward the main hall. A sharp, rhythmic, metallic thwack echoed down the stone corridor. It was not the manic pacing of a broken man, nor the terrifying sound of a crowbar shattering a false wall. It was the steady, deliberate sound of a hammer driving iron into wood. Ada stopped at the archway of the great hall. Lord Vance stood near the massive front doors. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, exposing the thick, raised pink scar on his shoulder where Silas's switchblade had bitten deep. He held a heavy blacksmith's hammer. With 3 forceful, precise strikes, he drove a thick, solid iron peg deep into the heavy oak paneling of the wall. He lowered the hammer. He didn't look at her yet. He reached down to the flagstones at his feet. Lying there was a tattered, filthy pile of canvas and thin wool. It was the coat Ada had worn down into the deep tunnels. It was the same ruined garment the executioner had ripped from her shoulders on the gallows, stained with old blood, coal dust, and the bitter sulfur of the vault. Vance picked it up. He walked slowly to the roaring fire in the center of the hall. He didn't hesitate. He tossed the ruined coat directly into the flames. The dry, rotted fabric caught instantly. Ada stood perfectly still, watching the flames consume the very last physical remnant of her absolute lowest point. The smell of burning wool and stale dirt filled the air for a brief moment before being drawn up the massive stone chimney. The cage was finally entirely ash. Vance turned his back to the fire. He walked over to a polished wooden bench near the door. Resting on it was a brand new garment. It was a heavy, dark wool coat, completely lined with thick, soft sheepskin. It was impeccably tailored, durable, and incredibly warm. It was not a servant's cloak. It was the coat of a permanent resident. Vance picked it up. He walked back to the freshly driven iron peg. He lifted the heavy wool and hooked it securely onto the iron. It hung perfectly, casting a long, solid shadow against the stone, right next to his own heavy winter greatcoat. Vance finally turned and looked at Ada standing in the shadows of the archway. There were no dramatic confessions. There were no tearful promises of protection. They were 2 people forged in the dark, and they both knew that words were fragile, useless things. Vance simply looked at the warm coat on the wall, looked back at Ada, and gave a single decisive nod. He had permanently fixed her place in his house. She was no longer a forced arrangement. She was no longer a silent ghost. She belonged here. Vance walked past her, heading toward the library, the door now completely unbolted, to begin the honest work of rebuilding his father's company. Ada stepped fully into the light of the hall. She walked up to the heavy oak paneling. She reached out with her calloused, scarred hand and rested her palm against the thick, warm sheepskin of the new coat. The physical reality of it grounded her completely. She closed her eyes and took a long, steady breath of clean air. They didn't need the town's permission to exist. The lamp burned between them, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.